From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We're here today because President-elect Trump owns or has a controlling interest in more than 500 businesses, both foreign and domestic. We don't even know the nature of his financial holdings. We don't even have a clear picture due to a lack of transparency of exactly what businesses he owns. What we do know is these businesses pose a massive conflict of interest.
Donald Trump could be in violation of the Constitution his first day in office. That's the conclusion of some leading constitutional law experts. We'll speak with Richard Painter. He served as George W. Bush's chief ethics lawyer. Then, can North Carolina still be considered a democracy? The answer is no, according to at least one study. Plus, we look back at Saddam Hussein 10 years after his execution.
Year after year, Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
We'll speak with the CIA analyst who interrogated Saddam Hussein. What he says may surprise you. At the time of the U.S. invasion, he says Saddam Hussein was focused more on writing a novel than bracing for war. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Russian officials are condemning a move by the United States to speed the delivery of weapons to Syrian fighters, calling it a hostile act that threatens Russian forces and could lead to terrorist attacks on airplanes. The criticism follows President Obama's signature on a massive Pentagon spending bill known as the NDAA, which eases restrictions on weapons transfers to Syrian opposition groups. Russia says that'll allow for the U.S. to arm rebels with shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft missiles known as manpads. At the State Department, spokesperson Mark Toner said the Obama administration's opposed to such a move.
We've seen this before, this language before, this kind of rhetoric. I mean, our position on manpads has not changed. We would have a very deep concern about that type of weaponry getting into Syria.
Despite those comments, the incoming Trump administration could choose to arm Syrian rebels with manpads. Critics say the weapons could be used to down commercial jetliners. Last year, Amnesty International reported much of the arsenal held by ISIS comes from U.S.-made weapons acquired from the Iraqi army and Syrian opposition groups. Meanwhile, the United States topped the list of global arms merchants in 2015, driving about half of all weapons sales worldwide. A new report from the Congressional Research Service finds that despite an overall drop in the global arms trade, U.S. weapons exports increased to about $40 billion in 2015, and the U.S. appears on track to post similar numbers this year. Among developing nations, Saudi Arabia was the leading buyer, purchasing over $93 billion in arms since 2008. Most of those weapons were made in the U.S. and included F-15 fighter jets, Abrams battle tanks, and cluster bombs. U.S. arms were used in attacks on Yemen, where UN officials have called for an international probe into possible war crimes by the Saudi-led coalition. Donald Trump has selected Tom Bossert as his top advisor on Homeland Security, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity. Bossert previously served as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor during the last year of George W. Bush's presidency. Bossert is a staunch defender of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which he has called a just war. Donald Trump has tapped his company's top lawyer, Jason Greenblatt, to fill the newly created position of Special Representative for International Negotiations. Greenblatt's an expert in real estate law with little foreign policy experience. The Trump transition team said Greenblatt's new role would be to assist on, quote, international negotiations of all types and trade deals around the world, unquote. During the campaign, Greenblatt defended Trump against charges of anti-Semitism, serving as his advisor on Israel. Last month, Greenblatt said he doesn't see Israel's construction of settlements on occupied Palestinian lands as an obstacle to peace. In Hawaii, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor Tuesday, expressing regret for Japan's attack on the base 75 years ago. Abe was welcomed by President Barack Obama, and the pair laid wreaths at the site and offered prayers for the dead. As expected, the Japanese Prime Minister did not issue a formal apology.
As the Prime Minister of Japan, I offer my sincere and everlasting condolences to the souls of those who lost their lives here, as well as to the spirits of all the brave men and women whose lives were taken by a war that commenced in this very place, and also to the souls of the countless innocent people who became victims of the war. We must never repeat the horrors of war again. This is a solemn vow we, the people of Japan, have taken.
Chinese officials blasted the Japanese prime minister's comments at Pearl Harbor, calling Abe unrepentant for war crimes committed by Japanese soldiers in China and Korea before 1945. The comments came amidst mounting tensions in the Western Pacific, where China recently steamed an aircraft carrier and other warships near the southern coast of Taiwan. In North Dakota, water protectors fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline say police arrested 4 people Tuesday near a construction site where workers with Energy Transfer Partners hope to drill under the Missouri River. Water protectors say the 4 were taking part in a peaceful prayer walk and encountered police armed with a water cannon, riot gear, and armored vehicles. Meanwhile, the company building the Dakota Access Pipeline suffered another setback this week after a pair of major investors held off on a purchase of $2 billion stake in the project. A filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission shows Enbridge Energy Partners and Marathon Petroleum Corporation will not meet a previous deadline of December 31st to complete a sale. The companies will now have until March 31st to consider whether to walk away from an investment in the pipeline. Energy analyst Antonia Juhas called the filing very bad news for Energy Transfer Partners, writing, quote, "If Enbridge and Marathon thought that completion of the pipeline was a done deal, the money would have been a done deal, too. This means they're worried and are not feeling secure enough to turn over their cash, putting even more financial pressure on Energy Transfer Partners," she wrote. In Cuba, President Raul Castro said Tuesday his country's economy contracted in 2016 as its major trading partner, Venezuela, suffered an economic crisis. Castro said Cuba's gross domestic product shrank by almost a percentage point, but promised the economy would recover in 2017 without major reforms.
Debemos despojarnos de falsos temores hacia el capital externo.
We should shake off fake fears about foreign capital. We are not headed, nor will we head toward capitalism. We can dismiss that completely. That is what is in our Constitution, and it will maintain it.
Last year, the Obama administration restored U.S. diplomatic ties with Cuba and began easing travel and investment restrictions. But a decades-old U.S. embargo remains in place. Many Cubans blame the embargo for widespread poverty on the island. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has vowed to terminate the Obama administration's improved ties with Havana unless Cuba offers what Trump calls a better deal. Members of Congress who stream video or hold sit-in protests on the House floor could suffer fines and ethics inquiries. This under new rules proposed by House Speaker Paul Ryan. The move comes in response to a demonstration held by Democrats in June, when lawmakers held a 25-hour vigil to call for new gun control measures in the wake of the mass shooting in Orlando. When Speaker Ryan called the floor into recess, C-SPAN's cameras went dark, prompting lawmakers to stream video of their action on social media sites. Under House Speaker Ryan's new rules, such behavior could incur fines of up to $2,500 per violation. In Buffalo, the former New York State co-chair of Donald Trump's presidential campaign refused calls on Tuesday that he stepped down from the Buffalo School Board after he was quoted wishing President Obama dead and comparing First Lady Michelle Obama to a gorilla. Carl Palladino submitted the comments by email to Art Voice, an alternative weekly newspaper in Buffalo. Palladino is quoted saying he hopes Barack Obama would have sex with a cow and die from mad cow disease. Of First Lady Michelle Obama, Palladino wrote, quote, "I'd like her to return to being a male and let loose in the outback of Zimbabwe where she lives comfortably in a cave with Maxie the gorilla," end quote. In a statement published Tuesday, Palladino insisted he was not a racist and said he meant to forward the comments to friends rather than submit them to Art Voice. Palladino is a longtime ally of Donald Trump. Earlier this month, he met with the president-elect for 1 hour at Trump Tower in New York City. In Montana, a neo-Nazi leader has promised a march of heavily armed white supremacists in the city of Whitefish in January, continuing a campaign of intimidation against the community's Jewish population. Andrew Anglin said on the neo-Nazi website Daily Stormer, that at least 200 people will march next month carrying high-powered rifles. Earlier this month, Anglin called for online attacks against Jewish residents of Whitefish, listing their names and personal information. Whitefish is the hometown of Richard Spencer, a prominent white supremacist who has drawn favorable coverage from the right-wing website Breitbart News. That coverage came while White House Chief Strategist Stephen Bannon served as executive chairman of Breitbart before he joined the Trump campaign. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a professor of history at Drexel University says administrators are supporting his right to free speech after a satirical tweet prompted a backlash from white nationalists who called for him to be fired or to commit suicide. On Christmas Eve, George Cicciariello Marr wrote on Twitter, quote, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." Cicciariello Marr says the tweet was meant to satirize a conspiracy theory common among white nationalists. After the quote was picked up by Breitbart News and white supremacist websites, Cicciariello Marr says he received hundreds of death threats. Drexel University officials initially condemned the comments as inflammatory, but he says he's been assured he won't be disciplined. Germany's government has reached a breakthrough in negotiations with Namibia that could soon see reparations paid for a series of massacres in the southern African nation in the early 20th century. Beginning in 1904, German colonial troops responded to an uprising in Namibia with extreme violence, driving villagers into the desert, starving them, poisoning wells, and rounding up survivors in concentration camps. Last year, German officials began using the word genocide to describe the killings. Under emerging details of the agreement, Germany will not pay direct reparations to individuals, but will instead set up a foundation for youth exchanges and will pay for new infrastructure. A formal apology is expected by June. And Carrie Fisher, who catapulted to stardom as Princess Leia in the Star Wars film franchise, died Tuesday morning at the age of 60 from complications following a heart attack. After balancing her film career with struggles against drug and alcohol addiction and bipolar disorder, Fisher hoped to break down stigmas over mental illness. This is a clip from Carrie Fisher's one-woman performance, Wishful Drinking, which debuted in 2006.
This will really, really impress you. I am in the abnormal psychology textbook. How cool is that? Now, keep in mind, I am the Pez dispenser, and I'm in the abnormal psychology textbook. Who says you can't have it all?
Most recently, Carrie Fisher was a fierce critic of Donald Trump after Trump denied sexually assaulting one of his many accusers by implying she was too ugly. Fisher wrote, quote, "So you have to be attractive to be groped uninvited by Trump? Finally, a reason to want to be ugly," she said. Carrie Fisher was the daughter of the actors Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Could Donald Trump be in violation of the Constitution on his first day in office? That's the conclusion of some leading constitutional experts. The Constitution prohibits office holders from accepting any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind, whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state. Law experts say many of Trump's businesses are already benefiting from his presidency. Kuwait, for example, recently moved its National Celebration Day from the Four Seasons Hotel in Georgetown to the Trump International Hotel instead. According to Think Progress, Kuwait faced political pressure from the Trump camp to move the location. Other diplomats have reportedly been urged to hold events at Trump's hotel.
On the international front, Donald Trump broke protocol by speaking to Taiwan's president, marking the first communication between leaders of the United States and Taiwan since 1979. The call came after representatives of the Trump Organization recently traveled to Taiwan to explore possible deals, including building luxury hotels near Taiwan's main airport. Trump and his family also have holdings or projects in Argentina, Brazil, Georgia, India, Ireland, Japan, Philippines, and Turkey. Trump's businesses also owe hundreds of millions of dollars to foreign banks, including Deutsche Bank, UBS, and Bank of China. Earlier this month, protesters gathered in front of Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. to express concerns about Trump's alleged conflicts of interest. This is Paul Ryan of Common Cause.
We're here today because President-elect Trump owns or has a controlling interest in more than 500 businesses, both foreign and domestic. We don't even know the nature of his financial holdings. We don't even have a clear picture due to a lack of transparency of exactly what businesses he owns. What we do know is these businesses pose a massive conflict of interest. Exhibit A, the Trump Hotel. This is a building that is owned by the federal government. On the day that President-elect Trump is sworn in, he will be serving as both the landlord and the tenant in federally owned property.
Last month, Donald Trump announced he would be holding a major news conference on December 15th to discuss his plans for his businesses, but that press conference was later canceled. For more, we're joined by Richard Painter, professor of corporate law at the University of Minnesota. He was the chief White House ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush from February 2005 to July 2007. Professor Painter, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you start off by explaining what are the laws, rules, and norms that govern the issue of conflict of interest?
Well, there are several laws. I think the most important for purposes of President-elect Trump is the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which is one of the most critical conflict of interest provisions for all U.S. government officials. Nobody holding a position of trust with the United States government can receive payments from foreign governments, whether gifts or a salary or profits, and that's what emoluments are, profits or benefits. It comes from the Latin root emolumentum, which refers to profits and benefits. And so if you have somebody who's making profits from dealing with foreign governments or companies controlled by foreign governments, that person must dispense with those profits, cannot receive that money while holding any position of trust with the United States government. That applies to every U.S. government employee, including the president. And so what this means is that for Donald Trump, if he's going to hold on to these business enterprises, which present a whole range of other conflict of interest problems, to satisfy the Constitution, at a bare minimum, what he's going to have to do is get the foreign government money and money from foreign government-controlled corporations out of his business enterprise. And this includes foreign diplomats staying at the hotels at government expense, foreign governments having big parties in his hotels and canceling reservations at the Four Seasons, going over to the Trump Hotel to curry favor. All of that is unconstitutional. Also, he has bank loans outstanding, I believe, from the Bank of China, which is controlled by the government of China, and some foreign government-owned banks are leasing space in Trump office buildings. All of that has to be dealt with before January 20, or we could have a violation of the Constitution. And that's a very important provision because the founders did not want U.S. government officials to be beholden to foreign powers. France and England, Russia, Austria, Hungary, they were the most powerful countries at the time of the founding of the United States. Their governments were a lot richer than ours. And there's no point having a revolution and fighting for American independence if European powers, through payments to U.S. government officials, could accomplish that which they could not accomplish militarily on the ground, which is to subjugate the United States to foreign domination. So the founders were very cognizant of this problem of foreign governments trying to manipulate our political system. And lo and behold, here in 2016, we have concerns about foreign governments intermeddling in American politics, and at least the Emoluments Clause is there. Bottom line, no payments from foreign governments to United States government officials. Now we have a whole range of other conflict of interest rules, ranging from bribery and gratuity statutes, which are criminal, and that would come into play if anyone started mixing discussion of Trump business with U.S. government business in a way that implied, well, if you do this, I'll do that. And the problem is the president is going to be responsible not just for his own conduct, but all the people working for him in the U.S. government. And if he chooses to keep these business enterprises over in the Trump Organization, and anybody starts going around the world trying to cut deals for the Trump Organization, implying that they might get some favor for somebody from the U.S. government if the deal gets done, that's exactly the type of thing that could lead to investigation of bribery, a solicitation of a bribe, and an accusation that someone is soliciting a bribe on behalf of the President of the United States, even if the President didn't want any of that going on at all. And that's going to be one of the risks if he holds on to these business enterprises.
Professor Painter, what if Donald Trump divests but maintains the ownership of his current empire under one of his children who does not get appointed to some kind of government position? Would that be sufficient in your eyes to eliminate the legal requirements in terms of any potential conflicts of interest or the emoluments clause?
Well, by divest, if you mean giving it to his children or selling ownership to his children, I believe that would solve the emoluments clause issue. I mean, there's some debate about whether, the government official could receive the emolument through his children. But if it's really his children's business and they own it and they operate it and they are receiving the payments from dealing with foreign governments, probably the emoluments clause would not apply. But they need to own the business, not just operate the business while he retains ownership. And that's critically important. In order to give it to them, he'd have to pay the gift tax. I'm not sure he wants to pay the tax. And he could sell it to them, but that might have to be done through a leveraged buyout. So there are a range of different options that could be explored with the children, particularly for the hotels. Or he could sell the hotels to a third party and then simply keep the cash and put it in conflict-free assets. I do think he needs to turn a lot of this business enterprise, if not all of it, over to an independent trustee who would function as a blind trustee under the Office of Government Ethics rules. That's why past presidents have done it, and I think that would be very effective here.
Well, let's talk about his children. And when you say his children, I think it sounds very innocent. But, I mean, very clearly his children are adults who are his business partners. As you talked about, well, if he handed things over to his children, but his children are playing a key role in the government. You know, he has said that Ivanka Trump would take over the First Lady's quarters in the West Wing, and then said the First Family would take over those quarters. A lot of controversy around Trump's children attending a meeting Trump held with tech executives. And it's not only tech executives. They are attending and vetting cabinet picks. Professor Painter.
Yes, I think they need to figure out who in the Trump family, who on Team Trump is going to be playing for the U.S. government side and who's going to be involved in business enterprises. Those who are going to be with the U.S. government need to be subject to the ethics rules that are binding on all other people in the United States government. They should be appointed to formal positions. Now, there's an issue under the nepotism statute as to whether the president can do that. The problem is, if the president decides to allow them to carry out governmental functions without a formal appointment, that is much worse than a violation of the anti-nepotism statute, as I interpret it. The problem is you cannot have people who aren't government employees, who don't have the conflict of interest requirements of government employees, running around setting policy, influencing other people in the United States government. I have the same concern, by the way, about Carl Icahn and some other people who may be advising this administration without becoming government employees. And that's an end run around the ethics rules and the conflict of interest statutes. That should not be permitted. So with respect to the children, figure it out. Who's going to play on the U.S. government side and be subject to the same rules as everyone else, and who's going to be involved in the business world doing business deals, whether for the Trump organization or anything else. But it's one way or the other, and there's been a lot of confusion on that. I don't think that's helpful.
Well, it's shocking to me that given the amount of time that Donald Trump spent running for president, that nobody in his campaign thought to think these things out before the election, because this is a very complicated entanglement of this empire that they now have to figure out what to do with in just a few weeks.
Well, I think most of us thought he was going to lose this election, and I don't know how confident he was he was going to win the election. I believe they made some preparations for a transition, but I think it's starting to dawn on him and on the family that he will indeed be president of the United States on January 20. And this is a fundamental change in his life. He's been a businessman, a successful businessman all his life. He's 70 years old. He is now going to have to walk away from much of that success. He can keep the money, but there's going to have to be some divestment and other major changes so he can become president of the United States. He's got a new job to do. It's a career transition at age 70, but he, like many other Americans, can go ahead and do it. But he needs to make absolutely sure that he divests himself of the businesses that create conflicts of interest or we're going to have 4 years of controversy surrounding all these businesses, whether it's these types of investigations I'm talking about, the bribery and gratuity laws, or plaintiffs' lawyers are going to be nipping it at his heels, and state attorneys general. We've seen even in New York, he wants to close down the foundation, and the state attorney general is saying, well, not until I finish my investigation. And we're going to have more and more of that type of thing unless he divests of businesses. I think he did absolutely the right thing on the foundation, the charitable solicitation. Shut that down. Focus on being president.
Professor Painter, just in our headlines today, Donald Trump tapped his company's top lawyer, Jason Greenblatt, to fill the newly created position of Special Representative for International Negotiations. He's an expert in real estate law. He has little foreign policy experience, and he'll be advising on all international negotiations. Does that raise concern for you?
Well, we'll see how he does in that. We've had many people coming out of the business world go into government positions that are really unrelated to what they've done in business and have been quite successful. We'll see how that works out.
But this goes to him being the lawyer for his real estate empire, now dealing with trade. So in the lead into this, we said that Kuwait, for example, recently moved its National Celebration Day from the Four Seasons in Georgetown to the Trump International Hotel in D.C. instead. According to Think Progress, Kuwait faced political pressure from the Trump camp to move the location. Other diplomats have reportedly been urged to hold events at Trump's hotel. And then, of course, on the international front, a number of different examples. For example, that first conversation he had with the Taiwanese president as the Trump organization wants to build one of the largest development projects in Taiwan.
All that's got to stop. It's going to create lots of conflicts of interest, lots of controversy, big distractions for the president for the next 4 years. That has to stop. And Mr. Greenblatt and anyone else working for the United States government is going to be subject to the conflict of interest rules, which means complete divestment of any interest that he might have in the Trump organization, any client relationships with the Trump organization and any other client relationships that create conflicts of interest. But those types of transactions with foreign, whether they're foreign business leaders or foreign government officials, all of that has to stop, or these businesses need to be sold to somebody else who could engage in those transactions and not have to focus on the duties of being president. But you can't have the president of the United States or other people on behalf of the president of the United States running around trying to cut deals all over the place. Imagine if in World War II in 1941, President Roosevelt had a Roosevelt Tower in Berlin and Frankfurt and several $100 million outstanding from Deutsche Bank. How would we have responded to the crisis in Europe? We cannot have a president who is conflicted by his own holdings outside the United States. Critically important. And that's the point of the Emoluments Clause. At least the foreign government payments are unconstitutional. But the rest of it also creates serious conflicts of interest. And prompt steps need to be taken to deal with that. And maybe Mr. Greenblatt and others can help President-elect Trump, when he becomes president, quickly move toward divestment so he can focus on being president.
And Professor Painter, we do not know, we don't have Donald Trump's tax returns. The significance of this, I mean, breaking with 40 years of tradition of releasing these tax returns, where he's getting his money from, even knowing the basics.
We need to get I think the president should disclose his tax returns. Every other president has disclosed tax returns. And if he hasn't paid a lot of tax because of a tax loophole, just come on out and say, well, look, here's a loophole. I took advantage of it this way, and it's fair, it's not. If it's not fair, let's close it. But let's be upfront about it. He needs to disclose the taxes so the American people could see where he's been making money around the world or in the United States. That's critically important. We do not see from the financial disclosure form that the president files and other government officials file the geographic source of the income that may flow into, for example, in New York, limited liability partnership that has dealings in, in Turkey or some other country. We need to have that information. He should disclose the tax returns, and I hope he will.
And even the Trump name on buildings around the world, does the U.S. government now have to protect those buildings?
Well, I think we should take the Trump name off of buildings, at least in those countries that have significant terrorism risk. But we've seen significant terrorism risk in Paris, and in many Western cities as well. So it's a serious concern. You don't put the name President Obama, you don't put Obama on top of a tower in downtown Johannesburg or Paris or someplace and then worry about protecting it. And the problem is the foreign governments might have to protect it, and that brings back in the issue of the Emoluments Clause. Is this a subsidy of a Trump business by a foreign government that has to protect the building? But of course, if they don't protect the building, we could have a tragedy on our hands, and we don't want that. So that is a very important step to get the Trump name off of these buildings outside the United States where there's a terrorism risk.
And Donald Trump's relationship with banks? What's owed, where his debt is?
Well, many real estate people have significant debt on the buildings that they own. And I don't think Donald Trump is an exception to that. Some of the debt you're going to see in the financial disclosure form, that's the debt he personally owes, but there's going to be a lot more debt at the corporate level that you do not see on the financial disclosure form because he doesn't owe it. It's owed by a corporation which owns a building. And the problem here is it's going to be difficult for the president to regulate and supervise the regulation of the financial services sector, the banking, the lending practices. Much of the lending is secured by real estate. It's going to be very difficult for him to deal with those issues if he himself is indebted to the large banks. So I think it's going to be very important for him to try to deleverage, sell off some buildings, pay down debt, or figure out some other way where he's not going to be carrying large loans from the banks while his administration is supposed to be regulating the banks.
And his hotel in Washington, D.C., it violates the lease that he is both the landlord and the tenant, and it says that cannot be. You cannot be a public official and have the lease to this hotel, which is a government building.
Yeah, I think he's got another place to live in Washington, D.C. for the next 4 years. So it's a good idea for him to give that hotel to his children, or better yet, find a buyer for the hotel. The President of the United States is not an innkeeper. He doesn't need to hold on to that hotel. He's got plenty of other things to do. And it's unnecessary. It's going to create a lot of problems with respect to the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution because of the foreign diplomats. We have the problem under the lease with the GSA. And all sorts of other problems. So I think he should just sell the hotel or give it to his children or somebody. He really shouldn't be holding on to that property.
Richard Painter, we want to thank you for being with us, professor of corporate law at the University of Minnesota. He was the chief White House ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Is North Carolina a democracy? Stay with us.
Tell you something, all that glitters ain't gold. It's been a long old troublesome road, and I'm looking for somebody come and help me carry this load. I need a dollar, that's what I need. Well, I need a dollar, that's what I need. Well, I don't know if I'm walking on solid ground. I Need a Dollar by Aloe Black here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
In North Carolina, a new report finds the state's democratic institutions are so flawed the state should no longer be considered a functioning democracy. The report by the Electoral Integrity Project, or EIP, points to extreme gerrymandering, voter suppression of communities of color, and the recent stripping of power of incoming Democratic Governor Roy Cooper by Republicans. EIP gave North Carolina an electoral integrity score of 58 out of 100 points, similar to the scores of Cuba, Sierra Leone, and Indonesia.
Well, for more, we're going to Durham, North Carolina, where we're joined by Andrew Reynolds, professor of political science at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, one of the founders of the Electoral Integrity Project. His new article for the News and Observer is headlined, "North Carolina is no longer classified as a democracy." Reynolds has consulted in over 25 nations on issues of democratic design since 1991. His latest book, The Arab Spring, Pathways of Repression and Reform. Professor Reynolds is also the director of University of North Carolina's LGBTQ Representation and Rights Research Initiative. Professor Reynolds, welcome to Democracy Now! Why do you say that North Carolina is no longer a functioning democracy?
I think if you look at North Carolina's electoral process and you look at some of the more recent activities of the legislature in suppressing access to the polls, taking some executive power back to the legislature after the Republicans lost the governorship in the last elections, and also the systematic way in which redistricting in Carolina has removed competition from the electoral process. So incumbent state legislators now are beholden to their party leaders, the more extreme wings of their party membership, and not the voters themselves. When you add all these issues and elements together, we see North Carolina as an atrophying democracy, a semi-democracy, a pseudo-democracy, a place where democracy is on the decline, the vibrancy of institutions are getting weaker, and the population is more exasperated and alienated from the political process because they feel it no longer reflects their will or their opinions about issues on a day-to-day basis. So we're certainly not saying that North Carolina is an authoritarian state. We're saying that if you compare it against many other democracies and semi-democracies in the world today, Carolina has become one of that middle-tier types of nation-states or states that is struggling to have a democratic polity and is on the decline. And if we ranked North Carolina blindly, like a final exam where you didn't look at the student's name on the top, it would get ranked alongside some of these states that we certainly look down upon as non-democratic. And so the Electoral Integrity Project, I think, is a nice neutral, non-partisan way of measuring the metrics of an election process. But my article was more about saying, let's have a moment of self-reflection here. Let's not presume that we in America or we in North Carolina are invulnerable to democratic decline, because it's been going on for many, many years at a low level, and now over the last couple of years we've seen that decline rapidly speed up.
Well, Professor Reynolds, but some who take a more historical look at North Carolina would say that the state has always had a rogue role when it comes to democracy. I'm thinking, for example, of the infamous Wilmington coup of 1898, when I think it was the only successful armed coup in American history, when a couple of thousands of white supremacists seized armed control of the town of Wilmington and removed at gunpoint all of the elected black officials at the town and killed about 60 African Americans, drove hundreds out of the town, burned down the local black newspaper, and installed a former Confederate officer as the new mayor of Wilmington. That was a complete authoritarian armed coup that was never beaten back by the federal government. So North Carolina, especially over the issue of the racial composition of the states and the rights of African Americans, has always had sort of a checkered history when it comes to democracy.
And I think that's true. And I think what it demonstrates is that for a long time, North Carolina has been emblematic of the struggle for the American soul, the struggle for the reformation of the American polity. North Carolina often plays out in a very visible way some of the big clashes between the forces of progress and the forces of the status quo, the forces of the past and the forces of the future. In the 50s and 60s, clearly North Carolina was one of the main battlegrounds for civil rights over race in America. And today, North Carolina has become the battleground for the new civil rights frontier, which is LGBT and transgender and gender variant rights and the treatment of our citizens who identify as LGBTQ. There's also huge issues of race and marginalization of African Americans and Latinos in the state of North Carolina. But at the same time, North Carolina has a huge progressive, quite radical and innovative community as well. It really is a battleground. It's a fault line. And after my article came out, a lot of news outlets said to me, is North Carolina unique? Is it distinctive? Is it unlike the rest of America? And I was repeating my view that North Carolina is not unique. It is just emblematic of some of the challenges that are facing many American states today.
And can you talk about states that you think are highly democratic?
Nation states or
no, states in this country.
States?
Compare North Carolina to other states. What would you see as a model?
Well, at the end of the day, let's talk about the elements that go into a vibrant democracy. That means that there is competition at election time. People aren't drawn and gerrymandered into safe districts where they never have to listen to the voters. It means that access to the vote, to the polls, is as easy and as accessible as possible. So what it means is that people are able to register, that they have the ability to vote, whether they're from rich or poor communities, from majority or minority communities, from urban or rural communities. And it also means that government is responsive in the way that it runs the state government. It puts together the public affairs legislation, the public interest legislation, the issues that affect day-to-day people's lives. So when you're looking at vibrant democracies in America, you're looking at states that do facilitate as much voting as possible and have a degree of competition. So I would immediately identify those states that have independent, neutral, nonpartisan delimitation commissions that are drawing the lines in a way that allows for a degree of competition at election time. And there are a number of states that have done that and are moving towards independent, nonpartisan commissions. It has to be said that outside of America, there is no democracy in the world that allows politicians to draw the lines themselves. I mean, I remember a few years ago working in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis being quite appalled at the fact that America allowed politicians to draw the rules of the game that they were being elected under. The Pakistanis felt that this was inherently undemocratic, and of course Pakistan has serious democratic problems, but they were looking at some of the failures in America. So there are states in the US that do a much better job at providing competition, and they do a much better job at facilitating everybody's right to vote. Sometimes mail-in voting, sometimes electronic voting is important. But at the end of the day, the national constitution is also going to constrain and craft the rules of the game. And in that case, every state is sitting under a national constraint, which actually makes it more difficult for them to be vibrant democracies.
Well, Professor Reynolds, you mentioned states that allow mail-in voting. There are 3 states, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, all of which use voting by mail exclusively, and they rank among the best states in terms of greatest democracy. Now, this would seem to go completely counter to the trends in states like North Carolina, which not only require you to vote in person, but also have stringent ID requirements, or attempted to institute stringent ID requirements as well. Could you talk about this whole issue of, is mail-in voting really safe from possible abuse?
Well, it's certainly as safe as any other voting system, precluding possible abuse. No system is entirely invulnerable to voter abuse, but we actually find that voter abuse and voter fraud is very low in most established democracies under any system that they use. And we also saw that in the US in November. So we're not really talking about problems of voter fraud. That is often just a scapegoat issue for other power grabs. What we're talking about are the broader rules of the game. And do the rules of the democratic game allow everybody to vote equally and give everybody the same chances getting to the polls on election day or before election day? Now, if there are requirements for voting which may seem logical and rational and fair, such as identification or any other mechanism that a state wants to use, that's fine. But they cannot be targeted at any one group in the society, any one majority or minority population. We've seen that in the worst authoritarian regimes and the countries that have lost their democracies, that the rulers target certain groups to marginalize them from their ability to vote. And they do that in quite sophisticated ways. And that's what we're talking about in North Carolina. And that's what we're talking about in other comparable states, in that there has been an explicit attempt to use voter requirements to marginalize the votes of people who might vote for one party, and oftentimes that is the Democratic Party. So we've even heard Republicans explicitly say that they wish to increase requirements on voting to stop black voting, to stop poorer communities voting. Sometimes in their more candid moments, Republicans in North Carolina have been quoted about saying why they're doing it, what is the rationale behind it. So mail-in voting is important and can be useful, as can electronic voting be useful. But at the end of the day, these are pieces of a much larger puzzle. There are so many democratic issues that need to be addressed, and all of them must be moving in the same direction to really bring back the vibrancy of democracy.
Andrew Reynolds, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Political Science at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We'll link to your article in the News and Observer. Its headline, North Carolina is no longer classified as a democracy. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, you may be shocked what this CIA analyst will tell us about his interrogation of a president. It was Saddam Hussein over 10 years ago. Stay with us.
What a time to be alive. What a time to be alive. The revolution has come. What a time to be alive. What a time to be alive. When we stand up, we already won. What a time to be alive. What a time to be alive. The revolution has come. What a time to be alive. When we stand up, we've already won. People all over the world are standing up, saying we ain't gonna take it no more. Speak truth to power, a change gonna come. This we know.
The Revolution Has Come by Reverend Sekou and the Holy Ghost. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, 10 years ago this week, on December 30th, 2006, former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was executed. Hussein was toppled soon after the U.S. invasion began in 2003. U.S. President George W. Bush launched the invasion on the false premise that Hussein had stockpiled weapons of mass destruction and had ties to al-Qaeda. The invasion destabilized Iraq and the region, leaving over 1 million people dead, and the fighting continues in Iraq and Syria. A stunning new book about the Iraq War has just come out from a perspective we have not yet heard from. It is written by John Nixon, the CIA analyst who interrogated Saddam Hussein after his capture 13 years ago. Nixon reveals that much of what the CIA believed they knew about Saddam Hussein at the time of the invasion was wrong. During his interrogation, Hussein revealed that by 2003, he had largely turned over power to his aides so he could concentrate on writing a novel. There was no program of weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein was also deeply critical of al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups inspired by Wahhabism. In fact, Hussein told Nixon that he felt the United States and Iraq were natural allies in the fight against extremism. During the interrogation, Saddam Hussein also had a warning for the United States about Iraq. He said, quote, "You're going to fail. you're going to find that it is not so easy to govern Iraq. You're going to fail in Iraq because you do not know the language, the history, and you do not understand the Arab mind, Saddam Hussein said. Well, joining us now is the former CIA analyst John Nixon, author of the new book, Debriefing the President, The Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. I mean, what you write in this book is quite stunning. You are the first person that went to interrogate Saddam Hussein. You had studied him for years.
Yes.
And what you found when you met him shocked you.
Yes. Yes, you know, it's one thing to see somebody on a TV screen or a film or in pictures, but when you actually meet them up close and then you start talking to them, it's an entirely different thing. And, you know, instead of finding the butcher of Baghdad, I found myself talking to this aging Iraqi grandfather, and one of the things that really struck me was, in talking to him, he said to me, he said, you know, I've been working on this novel, and the delegation of power was something that we at the CIA really hadn't been aware of. We still thought of Saddam as the master manipulator and someone who was always pulling the strings, but really he had given that power, the day-to-day running of the country, to some of his more senior aides.
And set the scene for us. How were you chosen for this for this mission, and also how did you carry it out? Who was in the room with you, and what were the dynamics?
Well, I had studied Saddam Hussein ever since joining the agency in 1998. And I think a lot of people knew me in the intelligence community as sort of a go-to person on Saddam. Now, when I went to Baghdad in 2003, I was asked to fill in for we had an HVT-1 analyst in the station, and their job was to work with the military in trying to locate him.
You speak Arabic?
No, I do not. I mean, I have a smattering of a little bit here and there that I picked up over time. But anyway, I replaced him and began working with the military. I began to despair that we would never find him. And then right around Thanksgiving time, things started to heat up. And then into the first week of December, it became very clear we were going to find him. And the night of the capture, I was brought into the station chief's office and asked how would I identify him. And then I was asked to go out and identify him. And I told them that, you know, I would look for certain markings, certain tribal tattoos. And when I was brought out there, you have to understand the U.S. government was under a lot of, well, we were under a lot of pressure from Washington to find him and to also to verify it's him, because we didn't want to then say we've caught him and then find out it wasn't him. And there was also this persistent myth about body doubles, which were never really true to begin with. So I went out there, and despite the fact that I was looking for these markings, I have to admit, the first time that I even laid eyes on him, I knew it was him. And one of the interesting things about that first time was, you know, Saddam was sitting there with the military all around him, and he sort of acted like he was the host, that he was the person, like he came here every Saturday night and had an audience with people, and that we were just guests. And, you know, we had a very sort of a confrontational interrogation that night, because it was just, again, about identifying him, although in my head it was clear. After that, we began debriefing him. And that's when one of the surprising things about Saddam was he was one of the most charismatic individuals I've ever met in my life. I mean, when he walked in a room, even in his diminished status as a prisoner, when he walked in a room, you could feel a change. In the beginning, he was very smart, very polite, very nice, self-deprecating in his humor.
And did you conduct most of these interviews through an interpreter, or did he speak English?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. We had, in the room, it was myself, a polygrapher, an interpreter provided by the Army,
a polygrapher, meaning he was always taking a polygraph?
No. He was a polygrapher, but he also served as a sort of a facilitator, as a person who would sort of start the conversation off. And in the beginning, it was we weren't sure if Saddam was going to cooperate, and we had really no way to kind of get him to cooperate. So we appealed to his vanity, and we also appealed to his sense of history. And we said to him, you know, this is your opportunity to set the record straight. This is your opportunity to take all the lies that have been said about you, and what you say will be read by the highest levels of the government, meaning the president.
What did he say about weapons of mass destruction?
He said he stopped his program years ago. And You know, one of the things with Saddam was he was also one of the most suspicious people I've ever met, and he always answered questions with questions of his own. And one of the problems from that was when we would ask about weapons of mass destruction, he would say, oh, well, I stopped that in 1989. And then you would say, but Saddam, right up until the first Gulf War, we found that you had a program that was close to being near completion. He said, oh, well, yes, but after the Gulf War, I stopped it. And then we would say, well, what about 1995 when Hussein Kamel defected and you showed us all those documents that were on his chicken farm? He said, oh, of course. But after 95. So you were never sure sometimes what he was saying was the truth or not. But based on talking to him, talking to a number of his advisors, and all of the captured documentation, and the fact that we never found anything, I came to the conclusion that he was not going to start another program.
And you also asked him about chemical weapons that are being used on his own people, yes. And you were surprised and later confirmed what he said.
Yes, I did. That was shocking. Because one of the arguments made for the war was that he had used weapons of mass destruction on his people. And when I talked to him, and he got very upset, probably the angriest he ever got with me during my time with him, he said that he did not order chemical weapons to be used in Halabja against the Kurds. I have to admit, I didn't believe him at the time. When I went back to Washington, I started looking into this a little more deeply. I started reading some of the debriefings of other senior government aides. They corroborated that story, and then we found documentation from the Iraqis that also corroborated that. It was a battlefield decision made by an Iraqi commander at the scene. And Saddam actually was angry at the commander for having made that decision, largely because the use of the chemical weapons was in PUK territory. They were allied with Iran, and he was afraid that Iran would make hay out of this with the international media.
Saddam Hussein said the U.S. and Iraq would be allies in the fight against extremism and al-Qaeda.
Yes. Well, he thought we were natural allies in this, and he thought that 9/11 was going to bring the United States and Iraq closer together. And, you know, he at one point he said to me, he said, "Didn't you read the letter that I sent, that I sent you?" And I said, "What letter are you talking about?" He said, "The letter I gave to Tariq Aziz. Didn't you read it?" And then I said, "Well, I think you sent a couple of letters." And he said, "Well, this one went to Ramsey Clark. Didn't you read?" And then I told him that, a lot of people in the media tend to dispel what Ramsey Clark says, and the fact that it was coming from you may have been even harder for people to believe. Saddam Hussein did not have a good understanding of America. He didn't have a good understanding of international relations.
Before we wrap up, though, we'll do
Sure.
part 2 and post it online. The response of the CIA in
Yes.
the information that you got, the response of President Bush.
Yeah. All they really wanted to know about was WMD. And when we didn't have the answer that they wanted, they kind of lost interest. And that's all it was about, I think. And it was very disappointing and disillusioning because we could have learned a great deal more from Saddam and about his country. I felt I did when I was talking to him.
Well, this undercut President Bush's justification for this war.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
So they just didn't release or work with this information.
Right. It's almost like in January of 2004, President Bush's attitude was, I'm done with Iraq. Let's move on. This is a solved problem.
Well, clearly it isn't 10 years, more than 10 years later. We're going to do part 2 of this conversation and post it at DemocracyNow.org. John Nixon is a former CIA senior analyst, author of the new book, Debriefing the President, The Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, and Andre Lewis. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, our engineers. Special thanks to Elizabeth Press, Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.